Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's event. We've got people joining from all sorts of different time zones, so it's wonderful to see you all. We have an interesting couple of hours ahead of us. So I'll say at the outset that we can't run on too long because a couple of our discussants are joining us from Asia, where it's already quite late, and we are genuinely very grateful for them taking part despite the time difference. So the format today is dialogue, no PowerPoint slides, just a proper conversation. And this feels fitting, as Confucius said in the Analects, 三人行，必有我师焉. Where when walking together with two others, I'm always able to find a teacher from amongst them. I'm always able to learn something from them. And that's very much the hope for this meeting if you walk with us till the end. And leading that conversation, or at least starting it, is myself. If you don't know me, my name is Ibrar Bhatt, and I'm based at Queen's University in Belfast. Having said that, till the end of the year, I'll be a visiting faculty at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Qatar. And actually, that's the first time I've told anybody outside of the house, so you're the first to hear it. More importantly, let me introduce our two main speakers and our discussants. So first, Muhammad Faruque, who is the Inayat Malik Associate Professor and a Taft Distinguished Professor at the University of Cincinnati. He also holds a visiting scholar position at Harvard University. He is the author of the award-winning book Sculpting the Self by University of Michigan Press. He also has a forthcoming book on the interconnected universe by University of Pittsburgh Press, and you can read his full profile online. And joining him is Professor Shuchen Xiang, Mount Hua Professor of Philosophy at Xidian University in Xi'an, in China. She's the author of A Philosophical Defense of Culture, Perspectives from Confucianism and Caesira, and Chinese Cosmopolitanism, The History and Philosophy of an Idea. You can read her full profile online as well. So, following my conversation with Muhammad and Shuchen, we will be joined by three notable discussants. Professor Syed Farid Alatas of the University of Malaya, a renowned decolonial theorist, formerly at the National University of Singapore. Professor Roy Yang, who I don't think is in the room right now, hopefully he'll come in later on, who's Dean of Education at the University of Hong Kong and author of the landmark book the Chinese Idea of the University, and Dr. Farah Ahmed of the University of Cambridge, whose work bridges philosophies of Islamic education with Southern critical indigenous research methodologies. So here's how the next couple of hours will pan out, I hope. I will begin with a brief bit of context to set the scene, and then I'll put some questions to Muhammad and Shuchan. And in their answers, they will draw out particular philosophical positions for higher education. And then we'll turn to our discussants for their reflections and indeed questions in response to those positions. And finally, if time allows, we'll open it up to the audience. So I hope that sounds clear. So with that out of the way, let's turn to the theme for today. In recent years, there's been an increasing deployment of the trope of decolonization in higher education research. But often this discourse proceeds without sustained engagement with the philosophical foundations of that which is being critiqued, loosely framed by many as so-called Western epistemology, and nor is there sometimes a detailed exposition of that which is being proposed as an alternative, the latter often categorized under the equally nebulous label of epistemologies of the South. This raises an important concern, for me at least, in the many articles that I read and review as an academic, that debates around decolonization risk remaining at the level of identity gestures and surface critiques without engaging with the deeper philosophical structures that shape knowledge, education, and life and learning. In a dialogue I convened last year with the social theorist Said Farid Alatas, who coincidentally is with us again today, we explored the idea that decolonization can be understood as occurring through distinct phases. The first is critique, the necessary interrogation of hegemonic frameworks. And then there's construction, where philosophical resources from so-called non-Western traditions are brought to bear on contemporary research problems. But to move meaningfully through these stages, we might need a kind of philosophical ground clearing exercise. And today is intended to be that kind of exercise to contribute to that broader intellectual task. There might be a wider context to this conversation. In the early 1990s, a thesis of Samuel Huntington deemed one major threat to Western interests as the possibility of an alignment between Chinese and Islamic civilizations. The Islamic professor, philosopher, Sayyid Hossein Nasr, also noted that when non-Western traditions enter into dialogue, it's often only with the West, and that the different Orients, the non-West, rarely have their own conversation with each other. Reductive framings of East and West should not apply because there are many Easts and there are many Wests. If I had a penny for every student and academic who wanted to do an East-West comparative study, I'd probably have enough cash to invite you all in person for this event, though perhaps that would still not be enough to convince those people that that binary is nonsense. Because one of the signs of Eurocentrism is that people keep talking about it. Chinese and Islamic philosophical traditions are important because they are pre-Western in that they precede the modern Western intellectual formation. They are also post-Western in that they are more than Western without precluding it. No one is being exclusionary. They thus speak beyond the experience of colonial modernity. Chinese and Islamic philosophy are collectively the civilizational lifeblood for most of humanity. So the questions that animate this dialogue are simple but important. What might we learn from bringing these two traditions into conversation, specifically in relation to higher education today? What do they offer in rethinking the aims of higher learning, the nature of knowledge, and the mission of the university? Of course, there's a history to such exchanges. Some are, stretching back centuries perhaps, but we only need to recall the recent dialogues between Sayyid Hossein Nasr and Tu Weiming, which exemplify the kind of engagement I hope we will have today. And with that, I'll begin my first question to Muhammad and Shuchen. To begin, could you briefly define what you, Muhammad, mean by Islamic philosophy and Shuchen, Chinese philosophy, particularly in relation to the place for these ideas in higher education? What are the metaphysical, epistemological, and ethical orientations of these ideas, and what distinguishes them from Western philosophical frameworks that underpin the modern university model?
Thank you. I'm not sure who'd like to go first. Professor Shuchen, Xiang, if you'd like to go first, feel free to do so, but I'm equally also happy to.
Yeah, you could please, go ahead.
All right, thank you. So I'd like to begin, first of all, by thanking the organizers and specifically Professor Ibrar Bhatt for kindly inviting me to this dialogue and share some humble thoughts about higher education from the perspective of Islamic philosophy of education. And as you provided that context, I guess we can go straight to the conversation and, I can talk about some brief introductions about Islamic philosophy of education in relation to the modern university. So before asking what is Islamic philosophy, I think a very pertinent question is what is philosophy itself? Because you might recall a few years ago, Stephen Hawking, yes, none other than him, said that philosophy is dead because science, quote unquote, has replaced all the major metaphysical questions, and philosophy, unfortunately, has not been able to, keep up with the recent developments in science. So from that perspective, just to any discussion on philosophy, let alone Islamic philosophy, is kind of meaningless. But you soon notice that when someone makes that kind of claim, it is already a very not just grandiose philosophical claim, because it presupposes what is knowledge, what is reality, or what counts as knowledge, and also what are human beings, and those questions. And as we know, I don't think I have to go through all the arguments. I mean, these are questions that empirical science, no matter how technologically successful it is, can ever hope to answer. So if you can see this point, then we can see why philosophy and global philosophy, including Islamic philosophy, Chinese philosophy, Western philosophy, they're always relevant when it comes to important questions that humanity faces. So, of course, Islamic philosophy has its own history, its own kind of structure, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics. But one of the ways people define Islamic philosophy, and again, like modern Western philosophy, there are many, many different definitions. But one definition that is very pertinent and that is widely repeated is the idea that it's the idea of objectivity, to be able to see things as they truly are. Al-ashya kama huwa in Arabic. So I guess that's even from a commonsensical perspective, we always hope to see things as they are. We don't want to be deluded. If we're talking about education, higher education, the reality of the modern university, we don't want some kind of subjectivized or kind of deluded version of what's going on. So, and with that, you can see what Islamic philosophers are trying to achieve. They also mention wisdom, of course. And when it comes to their general notion of reality, metaphysics, questions such as what is true, what is real, what is possible, those questions, the fundamental questions underpinning literally everything, our ethics, epistemology, metaphysics, they present a version of reality which is hierarchical, interrelated. I know the word hierarchical has, especially to a modern ear, a lot of bad connotations, but it's not exactly that way that they talk about it. But it's also the idea of interrelatedness that plays a very important role in Islamic philosophy. Now, when you contrast some of these with modern education, with the philosophy that underpins the modern university, you can see some of these stark differences, but also the possibilities that we can learn from Islamic philosophy. So I'll keep my remarks short. So modern philosophy, and again, I'm not trying to generalize, but in general, by and large, it's not philosophically neutral. It has philosophical assumptions like methodological naturalism, like empirical science, and sometimes even scientism being the kind of most important source of knowledge, those kind of philosophies. But when we talk about the university, it's also connected to, of course, we cannot separate it from wider realities of society, politics, economics, social expectations, and so on and so forth. So here I take a kind of role of a critique because, I'm a product of modern education in a way. I mean, not in a way completely, but at the same time, I had questions. So I traveled to different parts of the world and educated myself from perspectives of other civilizations. And I'm a kind of lifelong learner of different cultures and civilizations. So let me begin with this very provocative question that will bring us face to face with modern, when you say modern university, modern education, of course, there are a lot of positive things, but there are also things that are not so kind of rosy. And this becomes clear, especially when we ask these questions. So my first question is, and again, it's a very big, broad question. Can everyone live a good life without destroying the planet? I know it's very provocative. And what happens when a society no longer tells us how to live, yet continues to demand that we succeed? So today, when you look at what students expect to get from a university degree and what even professors are supposed to teach, I think there is the kind of overarching expectation, not expectation, but overarching idea that somehow modernity brings freedom, progress, and expanding possibilities. But at the same time, a relentless pursuit of these to whatever in a career also leads to, in today's context, tremendous ecological devastation, social fragmentation, political polarization, nihilism, and a growing sense of meaninglessness. And because we keep using the word science all the time, so we have been very successful in asking the how of things, how something works, even in social science. It's always about how things work, rather than like the why of things. What is the purpose? What is the meaning behind everything? So when it comes to the underlying foundation, underlying meaning of things, our ethics at modern universities, and if you look at kind of mission statements of top-ranked universities, whether it's in the US or even elsewhere, It's always about innovation, productivity, some kind of futurism, or some version of solving quote unquote global problems and those things. And the success of a university is often measured by, like employability, like how it's able to, for example, contribute to quote unquote social society's problems, and also rankings and those kind of things. It's never and it's never about it's what it means to be human. The extremely important foundational question in both Islamic and Chinese philosophy, going back to Mencius and even the great Confucian book, The Great Learning, Da Xue, in, forgive my Chinese pronunciation, but I mean, the idea of humanity, Shuchen, I'm sure will be able to say more, but the word in Chinese is ren, humanity, humanness, how to become human. That has been a kind of lifelong concern in many Chinese texts. And Mencius, for example, has this famous saying, the goal of learning is none other than to seek for the lost heart. And lost heart here implies, in some interpretations, the kind of true humanity, or exploring the question of how to become human. And if you even come to contemporary times, to new Confucians like Tu Weiming and his predecessors, Xiang and Mo Zhongshan, you see the continuation of that idea. And the Islamic philosophy is no different. The question of, I call it the sculpting the self, what it means to be human, it's extremely foundational. So this is something that is just kind of beside the point, because it's expected that somehow everybody will, students, it's the responsibility of society, family, others, or, I don't know, but it's not the job of a university or professor and so forth. So here we come to a very focal dimension of Islamic philosophy, and also in Chinese philosophy. And I'll have a time to elaborate more, and I'm sure I don't have much time, but it's the student-teacher relationship. I'm going to end soon. So it's the student-teacher relationship and the moral formation of the student and that comes out through the student-teacher relation that has been nearly lost, except maybe in some contexts. And also the compartmentalization of knowledge. So I talked about Islamic philosophy and its metaphysics and epistemology based on this interrelatedness of reality and knowledge. Knowledge, epistemology, and metaphysics can never be separated. When we do separate them artificially, it leads to a situation like this. Let me give you a very quick example. So we know today, thanks to modern science, the forces, the so-called four fundamental forces, and the forces inside of an atom, right? Strong and weak forces and so forth. And we think this is thanks to Hume and people like him, the is, art, or fact-value distinction. We think, this is just a matter of description. But notice what happens when we are unable to relate this to some kind of bigger picture, the moral dimension of this knowledge. It leads to the atomic bomb. Einstein, despite what his genius and intelligence, could not foresee this. And people like him, Oppenheimer, they always regret it. But then, why do you think that knowledge, actually modern education, I would claim, is not even in a position to handle this kind of knowledge, although we always kind of say, we always glorify science and so forth, but we don't have even the moral resources to deal with this kind of knowledge. So there are many examples I want to talk about, but I think I should stop here.
Thank you, Muhammad. Yes, we can probe.
And just a brief point, if you can give us a reminder of like how long in the time and everything, that would be great, because I want to be mindful of that.
I will do that, yes. And Shuchen, so over to you, and then we can look at intersections after that.
Okay. So Professor Faruque already mentioned some very, I think, defining aspects of Chinese philosophy. So I will follow his thread. So he was talking about this sculpting of the self, this the name of his book, and yeah, it's very much applies to, if you had to characterize the nature of Chinese philosophy. So if we were going to, so I'll leave the question of defining what Chinese philosophy is for later. Let me first talk about what the traditional Chinese view of education would have been, because like Professor Faruque was was talking about, the modern education system really, you could say, abides by this kind of fact-value distinction. So then you have a real pure kind of, which leads to the kind of instrumentalism that he was describing in modern universities. When you have a very kind of valueless kind of value, which is profit, this is very capitalist metric of measuring the point of education, which is in some ways really kind of obviously like antithetical to the point of education, because because surely, if you depending on what you mean by education, but for me, education means something like what the Germans called bilden, the kind of the formation of the self, again, this kind of cultivation of the self, and that is precisely something that is antithetical to that logic of instrumentalization. And in Chinese philosophy, Confucianism, the very famous phrase is that 君子不器, that the 君子 cannot be instrument. So the person who is of high virtue precisely cannot be instrumentalized. But in some ways, the modern university necessarily only kind of has that instrumental kind of understanding of value. Okay, so obviously that already is going against these very traditional values of Confucianism. But like I said, so in the traditional Confucian curriculum, you had what they call the 6 arts, which is archery, charioteering, music. There's music was seen as really kind of very public aesthetic media, and then a part of the political, which is very different to our understanding of music today, which is this kind of private, merely subjectivist aesthetic thing. It was not the case. It was a public aesthetic media. And then there was the ritual, the fact that there was particular codes of body behavior that you had to sort of learn, which is a kind of phenomenological grammar of how to behave in society, and which is not static. It develops just like any kind of language does. And there's calligraphy and the mathematics. So I think if you look at what the 6 arts taught in traditional Chinese curriculum, it was a cultivation of self towards the ends of public harmony, which is why in traditional China, if you had education, it was always towards the end of the civil service. Actually, you learned in order to you were educated towards the end of public service, or you could say governance. But then that is also not this kind of instrumental sense, because in order to do that properly, it's related to this ability to self-cultivate. All of these things in traditional Chinese Confucian curriculum is about this kind of cultivation of self. And so the underlying idea then is that you cannot possibly be in public or serve the public without this kind of constant sort of formation of the self, which then goes back to the point that Professor Faruque was saying earlier about this, the great learning. And yes, it's very, very true. In great learning, there's this very famous line that says, what is it that you're meant to do as a kind of, as this person of humaneness or kind of cultivated person? Well, first of all, you have to cultivate the self, and you have to alter the household, and you govern the state, and then ultimately bring stability to all under heaven. So that's the maxim of education. The idea of education in traditional China, which is a big task, ultimately bring order to all under heaven. But the way I read that prescription and the great learning is the fact that all of those things are a kind of internested series of relationships. You can't possibly cultivate the self without some view of your larger relationship to society and then greater orders of society. Ultimately, the greatest order of all society is all under heaven. So the education of the self is always is made possible under a particular horizon of relevance, which is the capacity to bring kind of greater flourishing to the entirety of humanity and the cosmos. So I'll finish on talking about what Chinese philosophy is. So, like I said, Chinese philosophy always had this very practical orientation towards this kind of public service, and then very society-minded. But that doesn't mean that Chinese philosophy can't be divided into the kind of categorizations of Western philosophy, so metaphysics, epistemology, moral philosophy, and aesthetics. And I think that if you look at the nature of any of those subsections of Chinese philosophy, you can see how it then is very coherent with its view of education. So in metaphysics, obviously, we know that the grandmommy or granddaddy of all the Chinese texts is the I Ching, which is the foundational metaphysical text. And then what that kind of text tells you is this kind of what, like the book says, the book of change. Everything always changing, and then the fact that everything changes is related to the fact that the world is inherent interrelational. Everything is always connected to everything else, and then making new connections. So that's why everything is dynamic and always changing. And so it's not, and then that I think really lends to a kind of particular perspectivism that is quite defining of Chinese philosophy. And then a particular idea of, and so epistemologically, Chinese philosophy is quite defined by this sort of perspectivism and embodied cognition. And then its idea of universality wouldn't then be a kind of transcendence of perspective, which is, I think, kind of governing logic of the kind of scientificism or positivism that Professor Faruque was talking about, and which dominates the kind of research university in the kind of Western mode. And then the moral philosophy then kind of also follows from that. So axiologically, normatively, we're most humane when we are sensitive and responsive to all the different perspectives of the world, as opposed to having this ability, having this kind of Archimedean perspective in which we can transcend these kind of mere subjectivist perspectives. So all of those things then I think you can see as coherent within its traditional understanding of education. Okay. Thanks, Ibrar.
Thank you so much. We're going to look at some of these points later, particularly with respect to translating these ideas in modern higher education. But I have another question, and before I get to that, the contemporary university is often understood as a Western construct with roots in Christian Europe. Yet, as George Makdisi and others argue, many elements of the scholastic method in the West emerged through encounters with earlier Muslim intellectual traditions, which themselves were influenced by Greek, Persian, and Indian thought. How should we understand this entangled intellectual history of higher education? And how can we use it to genuinely reimagine a model of higher education and what it should look like? Mohammed.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. I think that's an extremely important question. So there are many parts to it. So first of all, some very brief remarks on Shuchen's comments as well. So I completely agree. In fact, the more I study Chinese philosophy, it just surprises me, in a way that I'm always filled with delight. Like the overlaps I notice, but it's also, of course, it's when we talk about these different philosophies, they're not exactly the same, but there seems to be some kind of overlap when it comes to overarching paradigm, like Shuchen mentioned harmony. One of the defining ideas, I would say, in Chinese philosophy, as far as I can see, is the idea of harmony, and also the idea of the mandate of heaven, Tian Ming, Tian as heaven, normally translated as heaven. So that idea is also pervasive throughout Islamic philosophy, Islamic writings on literature, education, and so forth. How different parts cohere, just like in music, there has to be different notes. So harmony does not mean kind of uniformity and so forth, but it's the idea of bringing together diverse elements into a kind of coherent unity, and in a more cosmological frame. It's the idea of the unity between heaven, earth, and man, and by men, of course, not just men, but human beings in general. And if you look at Arabic terminologies like nizam, or balance, mizan, many words in Arabic express exactly the same idea, the idea of cosmic order, harmony, or some kind of providential unity. So whatever perspective we happen to have, whether it's in a modern scientific Chinese or Islamic, when this idea is lost, when we have scientists, Neil deGrasse, for example, saying, oh, the universe does not care for us. The universe does not, I mean, in a more, he uses more informal language, like doesn't give a damn about who human beings are. But notice the contradiction. If the universe does not care, because modern science already kind of divides, going back to Descartes, subject, object, the universe, it's the realm of objectivity, objective reality, human beings, some kind of, different and so forth. But if that statement is true, how is it that we as human beings who are part of the universe, who are part of the universe, obviously, we're not aliens, we're not out. How is it that we sometimes in our best moments do care for each other? So just like Hawking's statement, we run into all of these self-contradictions, but also it's reflective in the wider society, the separation between ethics, and epistemology, and also as Shuchen mentioned, the goal simply becomes utilitarian, careerism, workism, like going up the ladder and succeed, quote unquote, and have all the material goods and so forth. But what about all the mental health? It's now declared epidemic in the US, and also, I mean, throughout Europe, perhaps even worse there. So clearly something is at because when we're talking about education, university, of course these things cannot be separated from the wider social, political, economic crisis. So I think there is a crisis, and my claim will never be that Islamic philosophy has all the solutions, so forth. It's never like that. In fact, I'm very critical of the so-called Islamic universities. There are many of them around the world, and I think they have also failed because they try to co-opt a kind of Islamic sort of Western model, and simply kind of use certain Islamic kind of superficial veneers and so forth. So anyway, more on that. But back to your question about the origin of modern university, we also have to ask the origin of modern research university. And I know time is short, but let me spend just 1 minute because this is very important, and it's actually quite paradoxical. Shuchen mentioned Bildung. So if you look at the modern university, modern research university, its origin actually goes back to, genealogically speaking, Wilhelm Humboldt, the famous Humboldt brothers, Alexander, the more famous one in science, and Wilhelm Humboldt, and we have the Humboldt University in Germany today. So it was early 19th century Germany, nationalism and all of this. So university came out of that kind of context. But if you look at Humboldt's writings, and I'm talking about Humboldt and because that's the origin, later on, this is the model that was replicated in the US and also Europe. But if you look at Humboldt's own philosophy behind the establishment of modern research university, it's quite astonishing, because he uses the word Bildung. Bildung is very difficult to translate into English. Something like culture, something like the cultivation of the whole person, actually very similar to the Arabic term adab, etiquette, refinement and cultivation and all of these things at once. So Humboldt in the early 19th century was already arguing that even if you're thinking of just career, want to be a good engineer, even a good businessman, but you have to be a good person, because as a businessman, if you're dishonest, even that is going to harm you in the end. So, which is to say, whichever way, secular or whatever, you kind of think about education and its philosophy, you have to take into consideration the idea of human nature. What it is that makes us human. Otherwise, even pursuing those modern careers will not be kind of in the long run very successful. But today, when you come to the mission statements, when you kind of analyze the mission statements and visions of universities, it's hard to encounter. Maybe there are some exceptions, but very hard to see words like self-cultivation, something so important as Shuchen in Chinese and also Islamic philosophy. And there are so many terms that talk about it. Or something about the cultivation of the whole person. It's always about, as I mentioned, productivity, so solving global problems, innovation. Innovation, again, such a key part in economics as well. But modern university, of course, has this kind of contingent origin. But if you go back to the Middle Ages, as many scholars have showed, kind of point out, there was a lot of direct influence from the Islamic madrasas and colleges to Europe. Although some scholars today they always try to kind of play down that. But even the idea of having a chair, different faculties, even degrees, of course, there are some differences, but the influence on Western education from Islamic civilization is just undeniable, as is the influence of Islamic civilization, Islamic science on Renaissance and later developments in the West. So it's quite interesting if you go back, and Shuchen mentioned the 6 arts in Chinese. So Islam and the West actually share quite a bit here, because even today we talk about liberal arts education, we talk about trivium, quadrivium, and where did all of this come from? Of course, they have a much longer history, no doubt about that. But if you're talking about the Western kind of history of trivium, quadrivium, the influence of kind of 3 trivium and 4 quadrivium from the Islamic world is just, I mean, so plain in history. So yeah, there is that tweak. But coming now back to the last part of your question, so what can we do today when we have this kind of crisis? So when we talk about the alternatives, I think, maybe just 1 minute, I'm sure we'll have a chance to come back to it.
Yeah, we can come back to it, but yeah.
Yes, maybe let me just outline. So first of all, for me, because I mean, this is a topic you can kind of continue to speak on, but first of all, I think we have to get clear on our values. Even in the name of value neutral, we can never be, because we are human beings, can never be value neutral. What is education fundamentally about? And then we have to talk about the compartmentalization of knowledge and its problems. I gave the example already. We also have to talk about curricular design, like concrete steps that can be taken to remedy this situation. And also the teacher-student relationship, as I kind of hinted at, which has been completely lost. So, and then the way we assess students and also our self-evaluation. So there's a lot that we can actually do. It's not like, for me, when we're talking about Islamic philosophy or Chinese philosophy, it's not these are not just abstract, high-fidelity and metaphysical ideas. I think concrete steps can be taken without completely, doing away with modern university as a whole, because I'm not saying everything about modern university is bad, like its academic freedom or scientific research, but when it comes to its foundation at the level of philosophy and also a lot of other things on the side, there are problems that can definitely be remedied, and yeah, we can discuss more.
Thank you. At the level of philosophy, that's something that I've got lined up in the next question, so we can come back to that. Shuchen, do you want to address that question?
Yeah, so the original, the university medieval period, like the first university in Europe was Bologna University. They all used to train priests, right? It was like I feel like it's very different from our understanding of the university today. But the modern university with von Humboldt, I find it, yeah. So I have some friends in Brazil, and then there's a very big state university called University of Campinas, which is outside of Sao Paulo, and it's very interesting because the plan of the university was designed exactly like the view of the university that von Humboldt had, and then it was part of it was that all the disciplines could talk to each other. There would be much more cross-disciplinary research. So it was very interesting to me that when I went there, that in South America, in Brazil, there was this, I guess, moment of kind of revolutionary utopian desire. It was the Americas. And then they literally tried to build a university literally on the plan of the Humboldt idea of the university. So, and I think that's interesting because I feel like that building tradition is something so German, and it's actually very different from the Anglo-American tradition, which has obviously been proclaimed the end of history. And we talk about Europe. But I think there is a particular there's many different strands, obviously, within Europe. But in this case, the tradition that von Humboldt represents, which in my mind, is a particular kind of just German romanticism, which is very different, I think, from the kind of, I think the Germans at that time would have really looked down on the kind of utilitarianism of the British, because, you know, so many of them call just like the British a nation of shopkeepers kind of thing, that they don't really have any sense of value apart from capitalism. I think the modern university represents much more probably that Anglo-American strand, that kind of spirit, and I think that even within even within Europe and even within Germany itself, I'm from the discipline of philosophy, and I see the German philosophy slowly being encroached more and more by what they call analytic philosophy. So the kind of very this is a very Anglo-American kind of spirit, as embodied in analytic philosophy, kind of in some ways kind of colonizing German philosophy, because Germany kind of is a bit semi-colonized a bit. So I, you know, in some ways it's what the modern university is. Has very little to do with that kind of tradition that von Humboldt represented at a particular moment in the 19th century in Germany, and it's much more the values that I think that you can most clearly characterize as Anglo-American. So I think so it's so I just mean that the place that we're now, I don't know how much relationship it necessarily even has to the kind of medieval roots or all these other different traditions within Europe. I think it's a very particular strand of European culture that has just seeped into everywhere. And it's a kind of it's a kind of logic that you have to that's so powerful, and then so then you either have to join, or you will just become defeated, you know. So it's a very aggressive kind of logic. Okay, thanks, Ibrar.
Thank you. I want to look at plurality and the limits of the modern university. There's an increasing emphasis on what some people call global south epistemologies in higher education. One might argue, in fact, I would argue, that epistemology is not reducible to geography, but rather emerges from deeper metaphysical orientations and philosophies. It's in metaphysics where the real work is done. You've mentioned several words in your accounts. You've said self, cosmology, metaphysics. I mean, you try to use those words in a university these days, and people think you are should be, you know, think you need to see a doctor. But rather than in sort of identitarian gestures towards diversity, which is where modern university work tends to speak to decolonization. But philosophy is often neglected even within humanities disciplines, especially metaphysics. I think it was John Stuart Mill who said that we neglect philosophy at our peril. And to me, one of the meanings of that phrase is if you don't do philosophy, then you're doing somebody else's philosophy. You're outsourcing it to something else or somebody else. And that would usually mean a person but it can often, these days, it can mean AI. You're allowing yourself to be co-opted. And this links to what Alatas calls the captive mind, or what Ben Nabi calls colonializability. In other words, you can't do colonization without doing, you can't do decolonization without doing philosophy. Do you think there's something to that? And what would it mean to take true epistemic plurality seriously within higher education? And do you think that this is even possible in the contemporary university, given its liberal foundations?
Thank you. So again, a great question, and I have actually written something about this, especially in my article called Decolonizing the Muslim Mind, where I talk about epistemic colonialism and then epistemic pluralism and all of these, and also some of the pitfalls of the decolonization movement itself. So yeah, I completely agree. I mean, one of the, hard to find the right word without sounding strong, but thanks to all of these postmodern thinkers, although someone like Foucault might not like it, but all of these people, the French theorists, they have done much damage when it comes to the very word knowledge, because it's now a kind of taken as something commonsensical. When you say knowledge, people think it's all about producing knowledge from, I don't know, like pulling, like some kind of magical hat, pulling out something from that kind of hat. So it's always about social conventions, your subjectivity. But then, so it's always about your particular situatedness, geography, language, and hundreds of other factors ultimately behind whatever epistemology we're talking about. I mean, that's just so absurd. Let's face it. How about mathematics? How about something like pi? We all learn about the value of pi. It's an irrational number, right? Is this something any society in the past has invented? Or is something discovered? I really would love to know, but at an even more foundational level, like all of these rules in mathematics, addition, subtraction, even when it comes to more advanced rules in calculus, for example, are they all matter of social convention? I mean, this is one of the tragedies of our time when we lack that holistic perspective, logical thinking, just even the ability to think. When we lose that, and trust me, we lost that. I talk to engineers and people with PhDs in science and even humanities. They always, kind of parrot, if it's in the humanities, these postmoderns, or if they're not in the humanities, they simply don't have an answer to whatever mathematics that they use to kind of control, manipulate, dominate the world, and solve all society's problems, bring benefits to society. Yes, some benefits, but all of the catastrophes are also there. I mean, climate change to begin with. So yeah, I mean, these are all ancient issues. Go back to Plato, Islamic philosophy, Chinese philosophy. This has always been addressed. That's why I talked about that interrelationship and hierarchy of knowledge and so forth. So yeah, some knowledge is kind of situational, contextual, yes, but not knowledge itself, because that leads to just not even relativism, like totally you destroy, any meaningful conversation. Yeah, so I do think real, genuine pluralism is possible, and in my article, for example, or also in the book, I made the argument why that is possible. This is possible because all of these cultures, world culture, global cultures like Chinese culture, Indian culture, Islamic culture, Western culture, they do address foundational, aspirations, foundational aspirations of humanity and questions of humanity, like question of being, knowledge, and value, and so forth. But today, yes, from a certain ideological perspective, we kind of seem to acknowledge that. We think diversity means simply kind of inclusion. And as you said, becomes a matter of identity politics. But we never accept these and Shuchen, I had the fortune, I was fortunate enough to read your book on cosmopolitanism. You kind of also flesh this quite, brilliantly. So yeah, inclusion, diversity is fine, but not as true conversation partners. Not as true conversation partners from Islamic philosophy, or, integrating Islamic philosophy where you can really hope to solve today's global problems, whether economics, political, or political or social. Because you think those traditions, whether Chinese or Islamic philosophy, they're only good insofar as we take them as some kind of items in the museum, but not in terms of real source of value. Because Enlightenment, Hegel, Eurocentrism has already, quote unquote, showed that there's only one paradigm, one theology of progress, and so forth. I mean, if I had time, I would have gone over the specific arguments all the way from Kant, Hegel, down to even Heidegger. And of course, people like Fukuyama and all of these people talk about end of history and all that, liberal democracy. So yeah, more diversity is not necessarily pluralism, because let me end this with two good examples. You can think of teaching a course on classical Western music, and we can think, for the sake of diversity, let me have a Black composer teaching, some kind of, class, some, I don't know, mass B minor of Bach, for example. But that's not true diversity. A true diversity would be also teach alongside Western classical music, Yoruba music, or traditional Western music, or maqam music in Arabic, or classical dastgah in Persian or Indian ragas, that's a whole different perspective. It's not enough to have Indian composers versed in Western music to teach Western music. The same with dance. It's one thing to have all of these teachers teaching ballroom dance, and quite another to go into the classical Indian dance, Bharatanatyam, for example. So yeah, unfortunately, today all we care seem to be all that we care seems to be about identity and inclusion, diversity. We use those terms, but when it comes to, as I said, the substance of it, it seems like there's a hierarchy. We still think in terms of progression of ideas, and somehow Enlightenment, scientific revolution, Enlightenment, and 19th century secularism and modern social sciences, all of these things combined eventually showed us that blah, 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 all traditions, they're just historically, yes, interesting, but not real conversation partners. Yeah.
Thank you for that. We do have some time to go through some of that lineage, so we'll get to it. So Shuchen, do you want to address that question about true epistemic plurality?
Yeah, no, I really agree with what Mohammed was saying. There's just so much superficial virtue signaling about diversity, and really, I don't know how much progress has been made. Let me give an example through my own field, which is that of philosophy. So in the Western institution, something like Chinese philosophy or Islamic philosophy very rarely is allowed to be taught actually in a philosophy department. It's either gets taught in religious studies or area studies. And so that then comes with a particular value hierarchy that Mohammed was talking about. So if you're religious studies, then you're merely something that is mysticism or mythic, and something that can be studied through the positivist sciences such as anthropology, or I don't know, textual studies, some kind of like digital humanities, material studies. That's like what you can basically, if you're put into that pigeonhole of religious studies, you're saying that this is not objective. Whereas if you're obviously in the philosophy department, that is you're really doing the hard work of truth, which is why there's this inherent racism that non-Western philosophy is not allowed to be in the philosophy department. But then I think really sets up this kind of contradiction, which leads really problematic contradiction, because it goes back to the point that Mohammed was saying. Oh, Stephen Dawkins says, oh yeah, you don't need to do philosophy anymore because we just have science. Because the very fact that you have this identity of yourself, philosophy as the queen of the sciences, that okay, I'm this kind of a perspectiveless thing. Everything else that has a perspective and is merely subjective, you guys can go in the religious studies department or area studies. But by the very fact that you're setting yourself up as this kind of neutral Archimedean thing means that, well, what's the point of philosophy then? You just go to the sciences. You're never going to be, you can, in some ways, the analytic Anglo-American philosophy department now, it really has this kind of existential crisis, because now they're just cosplaying scientists. They always try to do this cognitive science kind of stuff, and it's like, well, if I'm gonna try to think about the brain, why would I listen to a philosopher as opposed to just a neuroscientist, somebody who actually studies has the material to really study the brain? Because if you're just going to reduce everything to this kind of scientific materialism, which you tell me is just completely value neutral and then the only avenue for truth. So my point being that the very way that philosophy is set up, then as pretending to be something neutral, then creates a lot of the problems that we're talking about. But something else that I observed that is very interesting then, so in philosophy departments, okay, you're not allowed to really have non-Western philosophy, or if you do, have it as a very kind of window dressing kind of thing, and you're not so in philosophy you're not allowed to have non-Western philosophy, but you have minorities to do that kind of philosophy that I described. So you can be, in terms of your identity, you can be diverse, but in terms of thought, you can't be. So it's and I've just seen this taken to like kind of comical extremes in various places, and I guess I won't I felt tempted to give the examples, but then I think that sounds a bit too personal. But it's just like it gets taken to the kind of comical extremes, the kind of identity politics, trying to seem like diversity by by approaching this issue from a kind of also a kind of bad faith evasion of trying to really deal with the to confront the real moral issue. The kind of the desire to evade it and try to do some kind of like little trickeries ends up being kind of very comical. So I don't think there's true epistemic plurality for the reasons that I said. But the thing is, I don't think it's necessarily so difficult to do it. I think that I think it's as simple as getting students to read the core texts of each tradition. If you just have somebody do like a guided reading, I think it's actually very minimum investment. It doesn't take a lot of money, and I think that that will inevitably very organically lead to a kind of pluralism. I really don't think it's so difficult, but there's, I think, political kind of reasons for why you don't have that.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. It makes a lot of sense. There are also other reasons why we don't see that in relation to. Um, um, I once asked a philosopher, have you studied any philosophy outside of the European Western canon? And she said no. And I said, why? And she said, because she doesn't need to and she doesn't have the time. And so those are the kinds of conversations I've had.
She doesn't need because she's true.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. Um, so I want to talk about the question of hegemony, and we'll have time for the discussants to come in, and then we can look at the questions in the chat, and then we can iron out some of these other issues. Some critics argue that both Islamic and Chinese philosophical traditions have universalizing tendencies, and perhaps even hegemonic tendencies. For example, Islamic philosophy's trans-regional scope, historical expansion, and the Chinese concept of tianxia, all under heaven, which you mentioned earlier, Shuchen. These have been interpreted by some people, some critics, as potentially hegemonic and inimical to the growth of indigenous ideas. How would you respond to the claim that these philosophical schools, in their own ways, could potentially be hegemonic and thus serve as new forms of intellectual dominance? What resources exist within the Islamic and Chinese traditions to allow for recognition and preservation of difference, plurality, and indigenousness? This is, as you know, a core aspect of the decolonial critique. So it's an important question to address in a conversation like this.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I acknowledge that that can sometimes happen, But then when people ask that question of hegemony, and it's always asked, I think, and the word universal, for all sorts of reasons, it's one of the most, for some people, the obnoxious words. Some people replace it by pluriversal, but I don't know whether that changes the meaning much. I use both sometimes, but for me, essentially, they come down to the same meaning. But I think there's a fundamental conflation between these two words or these two concepts. When we talk about universality, we're talking about a claim to truth. Universal, I don't want to, like Shuchen, my training is in philosophy, and it's not abstract, actually. It is very practical, but it just requires time to show up premise by premise, and which this is not the place to kind of do that. But universal as an idea, it's a very important concept in Islamic, Western, ancient Greece, ancient Greek, and which are also part of Islamic philosophy, and also Indian, Chinese philosophy, also, I'm sure. So universals are very important, and people say when they trace the root of modernity, it's with the kind of rise of nominalism, William Ockham and those people, that a new ideology, namely modernism or modern philosophy or modernity of some sort, began in the late medieval ages. So universals are very important. I gave the example of mathematics earlier. At a deeper level, that is also related to how mathematics is related to a higher form of knowledge, namely metaphysics, namely the rules of thought, namely our very ideas. Even agnostic scientists like Penrose accepts for that very reason, even though they're not able to articulate it, but they accept some kind of Platonic realm They may be ridiculed by other scientists, even though, I mean, highly respected when it comes to the cosmology. But you can see how this is important. So people, even today, despite being atheists or agnostics, realize the intuition behind, a reality that should transcend only the physical material realm. So universality is very different from how it has been misappropriated in history, especially by certain Enlightenment thinkers and colonizers and so forth. And I acknowledge readily that when you're talking about Islamic philosophy, we're talking about its best moments. That's not to say a certain idea can be used to suppress, and there are such examples in Islamic history as well. Use one version of theology to suppress another. So I'm against all kind. By definition of pluralist in that perspective. The university I'm imagining should have plurality of voices. Unfortunately, that is not what you see in most quote-unquote Islamic universities. So that is a problem. Because as I said, plurality acknowledges truth, but that definition of truth is not uniform, because truth is inexhaustible. Regardless of whether we come from a secular, agnostic sect or Islamic, Chinese, whatever orientation, when it comes to questions such as what is reality, what is existence, what is consciousness, on some level, you realize the utter, helplessness in the face of sheer, complete, pure, indeterminate, reality, which is existence. I mean, so at least there can be overlap that everybody should be able to find out, even though we may not be able to come to an agreement when it comes to the origin of life, existence, and those things. But such a thing as truth is there, but its expressions and different epistemologies can always be different. That does not make them simply historically or contingent or constructed. And Islamic philosophy has very good examples when it comes to plurality. So we have heard of Al-Kindi, and he's called the first philosopher of Arab. So Al-Kindi has an extremely pertinent, famous saying, which is the following. He says at one point, talking about responding to actually some Muslims probably who are kind of suspicious of his kind of enthusiasm for Greek philosophy or engagement in other culture and so forth. So he says something like, if I can recall it at the moment, all right, let me just paraphrase. He says we should not be ashamed of acknowledging truth from traditions that are different from us, even if they seem foreign. They have different, they're just foreign to us. But we should, when it comes to a question of truth, that should take the precedence, regardless of whether it comes from a Muslim, Chinese, secular, whatever. When it comes to, and we acknowledge when it comes to mathematics, and it is reflected in their writings. And it's not just Al-Kindi, down to Mullah Sadra of the, I would say even modern times, because Islamic philosophy is a living tradition. Mullah Sadra, the famous 17th century Persian Islamic philosopher, if you look at his writings, constantly citing, engaging, critiquing ancient philosophers, sages, one only wonders if he had the means to learn Greek, he'd be glad to do so, because he even quotes Greek words in Arabic. But he does not even distinguish between Islamic philosophers and Plato. In fact, it's the opposite. When it comes to some of the key issues, Mullah Sadra, to our surprise maybe, sides with Plato and Plotinus, and even ranks Plotinus a much better, more exalted philosopher than the greatest of the greatest in the Islamic philosophy, namely Avicenna. That is unprecedented. We can never find a single instance in all of Western philosophy where they do not even acknowledge the Islamic philosophy as philosophy, but something like Ibn Sina from Kant, an acknowledgement that Ibn Sina is better than most Western philosophers. I bet, if you can find any such thing. So yeah, plurality is real, and the traditions provide all of these great examples to kind of engage other traditions and make them relevant to our own concerns.
Thank you, Muhammad. Shuchen.
So the question of whether 天下 is also hegemonic. So on a purely theoretical level, if you're saying it's 天下on a philosophically, like the idea of universalism in the Western tradition, no, it's just like straight up no, because there's this very good French philosopher sinologist called François Jullien, and he wrote a book called On the Universal, and he tries to trace the idea of universality in the Western tradition, and he traced it to three different sources. First, the Greek philosophical tradition, and the then the Roman legal tradition, and then finally the Christian tradition. So in the Greek tradition, you had this idea of logos. So which I think logic derives from that, but logos is just truth. But which is it's very interesting because logos also means the word. So in that sense, it's like, okay, so I can speak something, then you can speak something, but whoever is speaking the logos doesn't matter, because there has to be a logos that transcends any kind of perspective or any particular person who's speaking it. And so he says, okay, the Greeks made this kind of that's how it was defining of being philosophy, that you have this idea of logos as something that is true, regardless of differences of where you're situated in space time. And then he thinks that this in the Roman legal tradition they had so basically this idea of universality first is on the kind of purely philosophical level, and then on the Romans obviously had the empire, and then they were ruling so many diverse peoples, and so they had the legal how do they politically rule. You had to have some kind of idea of uniformity, and then that was basically the Roman law. So everything, you could control the world really, or make sense of it through this kind of political idea, which is the Roman law. And then finally you had that kind of Christian sense of all ye are one and under Jesus Christ. So it's like universal brotherhood. It doesn't matter where you're from. You could be from North Africa, you could be from whatever, but then you're all Christians. You all bear a particular relationship to God. And so he thinks that I thought that was a very useful way of thinking about the kind of what universality means. And then if you analyze it in that sense, it's a very unique kind of idea. Arguably nobody else in the world arguably the West is the outlier in having that particular idea of universality. And that's what also François Jullien says. He thinks that it's actually the West that's unique in having these kind of ideas come together to have this idea of universality. And so Tianxia, why would it possibly be the same as that? It's actually a very particular cultural mix, this kind of idea of universality and then hegemony. Tianxia, it's really much more like the idea of harmony that Mohammed was talking about. It's about bringing consensus and coherence, which is so it's the creative ability to bring things into productive relationship with each other. That's the underlying philosophical idea. Now, obviously, in practice, that it's very possible that it can be abused. That because on a political level, that's very, very different to something that you're talking about on a theoretical level. I'm merely saying on a theoretical level, it's very, very different to the idea of universality. And then the kind of hegemony that results due to your particular idea of universality. I don't know what else was the question. Have I answered the question?
I think you have, but like a typical philosopher, you don't have to.
Can they potentially be hegemonic? Well, theoretically, then no, because it turns out theoretically, no, it cannot be potentially hegemonic. Right. Yeah.
Very good. Yeah, I see what you mean. I'm now going to hand over to our discussants, Professor Syed Farid Alatas and Farah Ahmed. I'll ask for Professor Syed Farid to go first because it's past midnight there now in Malaysia, and he's probably on his multiple coffees to keep him up. So you can come in and just feel free to give some reflections and some comments, perhaps even some questions to the two guests.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much, Ibrar. So I think I have about 4 minutes. Yes.
Yeah, if you want to go to 5, that's okay. But
yeah,
4 to 5 minutes.
I'll be quick. I have a lot of notes here actually, but I can't. I won't cover all of them. So I want to make maybe one general point, and and one specific point. The general point is about the role of philosophy in the way we think about the world. And I agree very much with with the problems that have been raised by Muhammad Faruque and Shuchen in that respect. But I wanted to raise a specific issue with regard to this, and that has to do with the question of whether we think. When I say we, I mean in general. People think about the role of philosophy in a deterministic way, as opposed to explaining, explaining developments in the world, in developments in the history of ideas, for example, or in intellectual history, in terms of orientations rather than philosophical doctrine. Let me just give a very specific example. In decolonial thought, there's this idea of the hubris of the 0 point, and basically this notion suggests that the European experience is projected, is generalized to be the experience of humanity. In other words, it becomes a specific, maybe even parochial European experience is said to be the universal experience of humanity. So, for example, 1492, the discovery of America is humanity's discovery of America. Even the way it is phrased, the discovery of America, it's never referred to as the European discovery of America. And there are many other examples from history of this. But anyway, the Latin American scholar Castro Gomez, he calls it the hubris of the 0 point. And I think this is something true. I think many of us would agree that this is a problem, that a European experience is generalized as the experience of humanity. So it's a kind of false universalism. The problem with Castro Gomez and with others is possibly that they explain the hubris of the 0 point, or this false universalism, in terms of Western philosophical doctrine. Many of the decolonial scholars explain it in terms of the Cartesian dualism. So this silencing of the voice, the experience of the non-European, the native, for example, which is it's either silence or it is said to be something particular, it's not universal, is explained in terms of Cartesian philosophy, a Cartesian dualism, the distinction between mind and body, for example. So in other words, it flows directly from philosophical doctrine. Whereas I think an alternative explanation could be that it doesn't come automatically from philosophical doctrine, but rather from the attitude of European scholars and others. In other words, they are being Eurocentric. It's not something that is determined by the philosophical doctrine. Rather, it has an extra philosophical determination. It comes from attitudes, from Eurocentric attitude or Eurocentric position, a Eurocentric worldview. And one could also say that one could say the same thing of with regard to the accusations that Islamic philosophy or Chinese philosophy tends to be hegemonic. I think any system of thought tends to hegemony. The question is whether that tendency flows from the philosophical ideas, from the doctrines, or does it flow actually from the attitude of human beings who espouse certain ideas? Because I think if we look at any philosophy, we look at any orientation, it has a tendency to become hegemonic. And that includes liberal democratic ideas that have become, authoritarian or have been interpreted in a way that they promote authoritarianism or even totalitarianism. So so that's the general point that I would like to make about philosophical determinism. The other point is a more specific point, which I thought it's interesting for me to think about. This is about the role of the universities, and I think everyone, I know both speakers have talked about the role of the university, but I wanted to just add to that because I think it's quite interesting that the European university, Shuchen mentioned the first in Europe, Bologna, but many of the European universities, certainly Cambridge, Oxford, were very much influenced by the Muslim institutions, even the actual structures. So, you have Cambridge and Oxford originally founded on what they called charitable endowments, which is basically a translation of awqaf, of waqf, right? Which is the Arabic term for endowment. And if you look at many aspects of the structures of these universities, Muhammad Faruque mentioned the chairs and so on. But look at the degree, right? Maybe it's not evident in English, but when you look at the French and the Italian and Spanish licence or licenza in French, licencia in Spanish, these are basically translations of ijaza, right? And the fuller expression is ijaza bihaq riwaya. So there are many ways in which they influence, but there's a big difference which I think it's lost, and it's ironic actually. Sometimes it's lost on us Muslims, for example. The Muslim university in not today, but in the past, in pre-modern times, the ijaza or the licence is given individually by the teacher, by the sheikh, to the student, to the murid, when the teacher feels that the student is ready to pass on his teachings. That's why he gives him ijaza, permission. He gives him a license to continue his or pass on his teachings. Because there's no authority in the university, in the Muslim university, there was no authority that could ban books, that could ban readings, because the ijaza is given not by the university, even though the professor, the teacher may teach in the university, in the Jamiat al-Azhar or the Jamia al-Zaytuna, where Ibn Khaldun taught in Tunis. They taught in the university, but there was no authority that controlled the syllabi, that controlled the curriculum, because the degree is not given by the state, by the government. There's no church in Islam, so there's no church to grant the degrees. It is given on an individual basis, one-to-one. Now, when the many aspects of the Muslim university went to Europe, the big difference is that the ijaza, or which the Europeans call the licence, the licenza, was granted by the church. And the church had authority. And indeed, the church did use that authority to ban, for example, Muhammad Faruque, I think you know better than me, I think certain works of Aristotle were banned at certain periods, and other works were banned. And this was frequent. Later on, that role of the university, of the church, was taken over in Europe by the ministries of education, which continue to have control over education. But because in many European countries democracy developed, so the ministries also ran along more democratic lines of freedom. They were more liberal. But in countries which were not democratic, the ministries of education were, of course, not democratic, and there was far less academic freedom. And even in democracies like in the United States, you see more and more authoritarian tendencies developing in the universities. It's ironic that Muslim countries, including the Islamic universities that Muhammad Faruque has been criticizing, are actually Christianized universities. They're not Islamic universities because they're not following that early Islamic model, where there's no authority that controls the syllabi, the curriculum, and that the degree The only person who has authority to grant the ijaza or the licence to the student is the professor, not the institution, not the faculty, not the college, not the university, and certainly not any Ministry of Education. Um, um, the universities that we have in the Muslim world today, including the International Islamic University in Malaysia, in Pakistan, the one in Islamabad, and everywhere else in Iran and so on, they are all based on the model of the Muslim university that went to Europe, was transformed, came to be placed under the church, and then in a secular Europe came under the authority of the ministries of education. That is the Islamic university today. So it's quite ironic. So I guess, decolonizing, if we are serious about it, it's not just about curriculum, it's about the very structure of the university. Yeah. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we could bring in Farah, and then Shuchen and Muhammad, you can speak to further issues in response, or that you missed, that you didn't get a chance to speak about earlier. So Farah, are you there?
Yes, I am. So first of all, forgive me for not being able to put my video on. So thank you so much for such a fascinating dialogue and conversation, drawing together so many threads. I've got about 3 points to make, but before I come on to those, I just wanted to pick up on what Professor Farid was saying about this distinction between what happens in medieval Europe and how the Muslim medieval universities or higher education system continues to retain the authority of the scholar, the individual scholar. And I think that that's really quite a significant point. The reason it's significant is because it allows the scholars to remain independent of the state or the church. And that independence generates a form of academic freedom, if you like, in today's terminology, which allows a type of flourishing in society that Europe has continuously struggled with. And one of the things I would be really intrigued about is that I know that the Confucian scholars were also, in a similar way to in the Islamic world, they had a role of speaking truth to power and holding power to account and so on, from my very limited knowledge. But I think it would be very interesting to trace how where does academic freedom sit, and where does the role of the scholars sit in relation to power, not just in terms of the university and in terms of educational transmission, but also in terms of the wider social justice, or what's happening in the political kind of realm. So my contribution, I guess, to this forum is going to be coming from my I began as a teacher, a school teacher. I've been a school leader, founder of a school, and so on. So I've come into academia a lot later. So I'm always very much interested in the practical. Okay, so what are we going to do with these ideas? Having said that, my first degree was philosophy, so there is the philosopher that comes out in me as well. I think there's 3 points I want to make. I think one point that I want to make is that when you look in the Muslim world, like the World Conferences on Muslim Education, which were a form of you could argue as a form of decolonial activity that happened in the late 70s and the early 80s. One of my kind of comments on that whole process is that perhaps one of the things that we could have done differently is if we had not tried to sort of Islamize or de-Westernize from higher education and then assume that things would then filter down. If we had approached it in a slightly different way, because I think when we're looking at education at post-18 level, the kids who are coming to us at the age of 18, they are coming with a lot of different baggage, right? So if they are coming from an education system that is as secularized, as Eurocentric, as informed by the positivist kind of approach, as much as the mass kind of schooling, industrialized kind of forms of schooling that we see across the world, then when they come to university, which we have to undo any of that if we are to try and do some of the work that people have touched on in this discussion. So perhaps one of the things we think about is, okay, what are we doing at an earlier age? And in faculties of education, departments of education across the world, this is perhaps a question that needs to be seriously worked out. And one of the things that I think that is happening now, even within very much like with young children in a space, even in a primary education space, is how do we get kids to talk about universals and talk about different cultural perspectives on things, which is necessary because of the world that we happen to live in a much more globalized world where people are encountering things without diminishing or taking away from the tradition that they happen to be part of or their parents subscribe to. And I think that's a really foundational question. And one of the ways to approach that question is to use the resources of the various educational traditions that we have in relation to dialogue. So when you look at educational dialogue, or the role of dialogic education, you have that not just in the Socratic tradition in Western Europe, but you have it, there are forms of this within the Confucian tradition, within the Hindu tradition, within the Islamic tradition. So the work that I'm doing is around utilizing, learning from all those traditions, but from my context, specifically the Islamic tradition, of how to enable dialogue to happen. And one of the questions that emerges, which I think is very pertinent to the discussion that's been happening today, is how do you engage in dialogue with another tradition unless you have a mastery of your own? And that's a significant point as well, that if we're talking at a higher education level, we might argue that why should a department in a European or a North American university of philosophy incorporate other philosophies when that is the tradition that is of that region? I mean, you could argue there's lots of ways of critiquing that, but if you took from that standpoint, that would potentially also be the case that, this is one way of understanding how that argument is made, is that that different traditions would have their own different philosophy departments, different regions. Now, we know that's actually not the case, and Western philosophy is taught in many places which were colonized and so on. But if we're going to move forward, what we do actually need to think about, well, what is the starting point when you're presenting an argument, when you're discussing a topic, when you're exploring something, when you engage in whether it's a philosophical inquiry, a scientific inquiry, a historical inquiry, what methods are you adopting? How, which are the universals that you're subscribing to? What's the heritage that those universals come from? And I think that this is a big question that as we move forward, is that we have to educate from childhood upwards of the capacity to know your own tradition sufficiently well enough to be able to engage other traditions and to have with a mutual kind of respect. And that to understand that we are all seeking truth, but there isn't it's not to say that there isn't a truth, that's not the case, but there are these different multiple ways of people seeking out that truth need to be treated with respect. And if we're going to critique those approaches, we have to be able to do that with some evidence and justification and so on. And it might seem like very kind of amorphous and so on, but the work I do, we literally do this on a daily basis with kids in our schools. And we've done the research to demonstrate that children are able to, first of all, take on the agency that's required for that, have a respect for the tradition that they're coming from when they are speak from the text of that tradition, and engage other traditions and other thought processes as they are able to do that. And what we're generating is the kind of reflexivity that's needed, that when they then go into university, they are able to engage in these dialogues with a great amount of confidence, and to address some of the challenges and the, frankly, in some cases, oppressive practices that they're facing. So I think that we need to think beyond higher education. We think about education generically, and I think that we need to tap into into all the resources, Chinese educational philosophy or deeper philosophy, same thing with Islamic and the European sources, as well as many other sources, to try and resolve how we move forward and build some thinking about how we're going to move forward collectively. So that's just my contribution. I hope you found that useful.
Thank you so much for that, Farah, and Professor Syed, Farid, Alatas. So, Muhammad and Shuchen, you can just respond to that if you want to, in any way you like. Muhammad first.
Sure. No, thanks for all the comments. So I guess there are a couple of things. So first of all, some decolonial thinkers seem to be suggesting that we need to completely delink ourselves from the Western epistemology, which started from the Renaissance and so forth. So I'm personally against this stark East and West, or Islam and the West divide, because other scholars even pointed out the problems of just kind of generalizing these things. And also by Western tradition, I also simply don't mean it's limited to modern civilization or modern West. It can, in a way, go back to ancient Greece and Rome and so forth, which incidentally is also part of the Islamic in intellectual tradition. Many people don't seem to see that, but Islamic philosophers have been dealing with Plato, Aristotle, and a whole lot of ancient philosophers from the Near East, what's called Near East today, for more than 1,000 years. So much so that Aristotle, Plato, Galen, these are household names. My own grandfather, as I say to my friends, was actually named Plato, Aflatun in Arabic. And people may not even believe, the Muslims may not even recognize it because it's in Arabic. But this is an important point, the idea of dialogue as opposed to a kind of clash of civilizations, but as equal partners, but not simply, as a matter of historical curiosity and for the sake of diversity and so forth. And also recognize that something actually not so good happened, even when it comes to the very trajectory of modern university from Humboldt and Bildung culture, more holistic perspective to today's corporatization. I mean, I often ask this question, how is modern university any different from any other corporation? Because honestly, look at the structure, look at the vision and mission and all of these. It's all about economics most of the time, labor market, future labor force participation. So yes, this is the important part. There's a kind of wider social, political, and economic dimension to it. Education, social expectations, these cannot be separated. If social expectations about what is meaningful, what is most important in life, what makes life meaningful, and if they are not changed from careerism, workism, then I think there's no way we can hope to remedy the situation. So it has to begin with values. And one particular point where I guess we can agree with different definitions is the idea that whether moral formation, whether holistic perspective should have any role in education, whether it's higher education. Dr. Farah mentioned how it's actually should begin from a much earlier age. I completely agree. But the idea of moral formation, as opposed to being kind of supporting a kind of value neutral perspective, because universities never value neutral. Even when they claim, as I mentioned, they're espousing values like productivity, efficiency, innovation, and those things. I'm not saying those are bad. We need to teach our students skills to deal with the world, with technology, and so forth. But the idea of moral formation, and this also brings me to our earlier points about Dr. Farid Alatas and his the student-teacher relationship and the idea of getting a degree, ijaza, permission from your specific teacher. I think that is something we don't even discuss because we have lost the shared moral paradigm. We think it's all individualism. Everybody is in a good place to kind of, based on their education, decide, understand what's good and valuable in life. Really, I'm very doubtful because if universities leave this idea of moral formation to family, to others, and so forth, it's going to be taken up by wider corporate culture, social media, and this is exactly what is happening. And we can see its effect. So student-teacher relationship, how to reinstate that at different levels. I think one way to think about this would be, again, more holistic perspective, not even when thinking of children, not just in a cognitive development. We have all of these models, Piaget and others, and of course, down the road, we have more new models. We talk about experiential learning. It's, again, all about skills. Also, everything is about manipulation, domination, ultimately, and utilitarianism. To some extent, that is good. But that should be complemented by a harmonious understanding of the universe, what I call the anthropocosmic view of the self. Like how, and again, this is so interesting. Du Weiming uses that phrase quite often. In the Chinese perspective as well, when we're thinking of the human being, by definition, it should include the cosmos, the wider universe, not just thinking of individuals as isolated islands and so forth. We can see that it's corrosive effect. So those values are important, and I think student-teacher relationship and how they can all embody building other sense of humility to a more holistic curriculum. I think these are practical matters, very doable, but we need to change our social expectations and all that here as well.
Thank you, Shuchen.
Let me say that the modern Chinese university nowhere embodies any of the ideals we talk about. Somebody in the comments talked about the Chinese Gaokao, the high school examination. That is like, I think we just like pure instrumentalism. I heard somewhere, and I don't know if this is true because I haven't fact checked it, that the modern that kind of high school education system was kind of built on like the Prussian education system, because Prussia at that time was like pressure to industrialize, so they needed to train like really train a lot of technocratic people to be able to catch up in industrialization vis-a-vis like the UK. And apparently China whether they did take it from the Prussians or not, I don't know, but it's so driven by this creation of literally creation of instruments. Like they're gonna the people gonna create the AI, the people are gonna create we're gonna work for Huawei. I'm in a university, a technological university. They do not care they don't care. They train so many people that then go work for Huawei that it's purely they're just like, it's really kind of like the biopolitics and wrong over. It's really training the people for industry. Professor Farad was talking about the fact that you have to know your own tradition. And then I don't think the Chinese know their own tradition. They don't know their own tradition. Like in the philosophy departments, they're all teaching Western philosophy. And then the problem is that they think that Western philosophy, I don't think they necessarily think that Western philosophy is truth, that is somehow more true than everything else. They just see that the West was successful. Chinese are very pragmatic, so that I think they see that the West is successful, so that, oh, let's just learn whatever philosophy they're learning. So in Chinese philosophy, you're not going to learn like Muslim Islamic philosophy. You're not going to learn like African philosophy or anything. Like they're not going to learn decolonial philosophy. That it's just all it's all so instrument. And then the reason for that it's not racism in the ideological sense. It's colonialism. It's coloniality. Like they saw that the West is powerful. I just copy that too, And then so it's so all of the things that we've been talking about, it's not like contemporary China or Chinese universities offer any kind of in some ways they I think Professor Alatas mentioned this before, or I can't remember last time we were talking about, they kind of copied the West. So in some ways, in some sense, the innovation maybe kind of does have to come from, and it's the same relationship between Central American, South American countries. They're much more reactionary than North America, if you can imagine. Nowadays in America, it's kind of taboo to openly say that there's no non-Western philosophy. But like my friends in Brazil just been telling me this very major Hegelian guy just published this paper, and I told him about how there's no non-Western philosophy. That sounds like very 1980s for kind of the global North, but that's still, so there's all of this is still within. There's still all of these kind of colonial dynamics, and it's not like. So everything we've been talking about is kind of I mean I don't know quite as much about the Islamic context, but definitely in China it's not it's probably even worse than the global North.
Thank you so much. We can now turn to the rest of the group here. If people have any questions for Shuchen and Muhammad, or indeed any of the discussants, one of whom couldn't make it, unfortunately. Apologies for that. If not, then I have a quick question for you, if that's okay, Muhammad and Shuchen. So higher education obviously sits under the social sciences as a field. The social sciences are very much, based on a particular understanding of our empirical research. Think of a PhD student who wants to do a higher education research topic. Um, and to talk about the formation or the cultivation of self, which is anthropocosmic, you use that term, rooted in metaphysics, and both of you have used that term. It would be very you would be very a PhD student would be very hard placed to utilize invoke those kind of concepts and theorize at that level in a Western social science PhD, especially if they have a PhD supervisor that is rooted in how those things are understood in Western universities and also in non-Western universities where the Western model is uncritically adopted. So, how do you deal with that? Like, what's your sort of response to that? How could that be worked through? How could such a person work through this obstacle and bring in these ideas, these so-called non-Western ideas or Islamic or Chinese ideas, into their work as active ways to theorize a research problem in higher education?
I
Anybody
can
could
go
answer.
first, but I'm flexible.
Oh, I was gonna
Um,
say, Muhammad already used the anthropocosmic part. Does that come from Dewey Ming? So I mean, like yeah,
yes, as I mentioned, yes.
yeah. So I think, yeah, it's possible, right? Yep.
Yeah. So I do think, when it comes to ideas, you have to fight bad ideas with good ideas. So I mean the reason I mentioned not just social sciences, but also how the situation is worse when it comes to the so-called STEM fields. People can solve extremely complicated equations and so forth, and show their brilliance and genius. But when it comes to kind of basic question about the place of human beings in the world, even PhDs from top universities, graduates in engineering and other field sciences and even humanities too, they're unable to answer. And that's because many people say, oh, we live in a post-truth society. And some philosophers even celebrate that, and amazing, like, oh, this is good because then now everybody has the freedom. You can post your own truth on social media, and that's a good thing. It's what a better way to express your freedom. Imagine this is the result of, I mean, this is coming from a philosopher. Think about science, social science and so forth. So social sciences, science de l'homme and in French, they have a very complicated history. And they are largely responsible for the destruction, or what Foucault called the death of man. But they have not replaced it with anything better, except dandyism, except transgression, all the things that Foucault talks about in the name of his aesthetics of the self, and performing exercise on the body, and taking your body as a work of art, and all that. Well, we have art of living both in Islamic philosophy and also Chinese philosophy. I think there's an expression in Chinese I can't recall, but techne dobio in Greek means art of living. So nobody is against that. But when Foucault claims, as he does in his, I think, Order of Things, that Descartes was able to claim, I think, therefore I am, because the self was transparent for him. But, with the new episteme in the, what he called the modern ages in the late 18th century, you cannot reach from I think to therefore I am, because the I am from the I think, the I am is now obscured. It's totally ambiguous thanks to all the researches that came out of the social sciences, like psychology, unconscious, language, and economic structures, and all of these things that fundamentally obscures what is the real nature of human being, what is a human being. And it has to do, I mean, I don't have time, but this is all tied back to the Newtonian moment and how the French scholars, Fontenelle, Condillac, the people ran the French Academy of Sciences, they co-opted Newtonian. Of course, Hume was very important, but they wanted to essentially, do Newtonian method, apply Newtonian methods to the study of human being, and invent all of this, separate all of the social sciences from moral philosophy. So that's why I said that one of the problems in modern education is the idea of compartmentalization. We're very good, know extremely well when it comes to our little domain, in a little area of expertise, whatever. But we don't know how, for example, knowledge that we learn inside the forces inside of an atom is related to, for example, knowledge of the heart. There's not even a connection. Modern education, modern philosophy essentially fails to answer that. But if you compare this with Islamic philosophy, the interrelationship of knowledge, this has been discussed. There's so many treatises written about this, how theoretical knowledge, practical knowledge are interrelated, and how in turn they're related to existence, reality. So this is all lost. And as a result, we succeed in manipulating, controlling, dominating, and we say, like Elon Musk, the next 10 years AI is going to take over. But guess what? This is all good because we'll be living in an age of abundance. Everybody will have, of course, he is drawing from the idea of this Oxford philosopher who talks about superabundance, talks about hyper-utopia where nobody has to work and everything because of AI. Imagine this is the situation and this is the direction that some people think we are heading. So yes, I think there's much work to do at the philosophical level, asking what is knowledge, how does different knowledge is related to each other, and how we can bring them to kind of the actual situation. As I said, a student-teacher relationship, designing curriculum in a holistic way. For me, are ways that we can kind of think of making some progress.
Thank you. That's interesting. There's a question from Ali Shahid. Do you want to put your microphone on?
Yeah, so basically, like the little amount of time I spent at Nanjing University, and this echoes with what Ms. Xiang was also saying, that the Chinese themselves are not as much interested as much as foreigners. So my teacher was from Lithuania. He basically like sparked my interest in Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism, as opposed to the Chinese instructors like who weren't much into these modes of thought. So basically this, and also like, sorry about the noise in the background, but I've been wondering like this talk of decolonial thought like is like it also produces a certain discontent amongst people. Like, so for instance, like the opium wars happened, the British did whatever they did to China, but like a certain like modern British has nothing to do with like what happened. So I think like at a basic level, like you have amongst children, we have to put in like values of tolerance as well as like, and then like if these are not given at the primary level and you go straight on the colonial thought, as it happened with me, like it produced very antagonistic views in me, like towards the British. And now, like the British Council Library in Karachi itself is a kind of third space, safe space for me to be reading texts without any bigotry, to read whatever I want. So I just wanted to like put it out there. Start.
So I don't know if I completely understood the question. So it's just about the kind of lack of tradition within China itself, and then if you don't have a proper grounding in the tradition, and then you have kind of decolonialism, then it's sort of, it doesn't exactly work with that. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. Like in my case, like it happened as such, like, so you have to be like, the
Yeah.
tolerance aspects has to start from the beginning so that you're able to entertain different worldviews.
No, I agree. So I worked, my first job was at Peking University, and then there's the students there, and then the whole culture there has been famously described as very exquisite individualism. They were exquisite individualists, and it was I sorry, so that I couldn't sort of stand them, but the whole culture it's this kind of deracinated, I mean, China obviously never suffered colonialism like in the same way as India or so Indian subcontinent. But then it very, very much has coloniality, and then you really just have an absence of value. And then I think a lot of people have described China as having kind of this moral vacuum, and I think it's just gotten extra worse since the reform and opening up. And I think that's like a huge problem that has like it's not just like a theoretical problem, it has like huge social moral repercussions. I think Chinese universities now, traditionally, like there was something so sacred about the teacher-student relationship. It's so like Mohammed said, it's so corporatized. The teachers exploit the students, like there's because the students have no protection, like, and then they use the students, the PhD students, like their personal assistants, and there's so much. I feel like a lot of things that used to be maybe worked, of course back in history there was like abuses, but maybe in some ways there were some moral codes that govern things. Those things have gone, and then the institutions themselves haven't come up with enough of these kind of external constraints to kind of to order things. So I mean, I do think a lot of these problems have to do with this kind of aftermath of just how much destruction there was materially and then also spiritually of a lot of these societies. Obviously, that's not to take away from the fact that they should just do. A lot of people can do better. But I think if you this, if I had to assess, I think. If I had to assess like an overwhelming reason, I think that's a very big reason, just how destructive recent history was.
So just a brief comment. No, I agree. I mean, the situation by and large, in the Islamic world is no better, especially if you look at the Middle East and how they're adopting the American model and like as a higher education, and so it's so deeply modernized, but not just in education, but also in politics. When even the so-called people Islamists talk about politics, again, it's they want to have the modern European state. Anyway, I think one important issue in all of these discussions is the issue of extra institutional structures that have always existed and thankfully still exist, and I suspect also in China, in the Islamic world, because education. So education was not, again, it existed depending on culture, context, history in many different ways. It was not always like through a kind of formal institution. It was way more flexible, yes, student-teacher relationships, but even beyond those study circles in the Islamic world, there were always these Sufi, mystical brotherhoods having their retreat centers, all like in practically every city, in major city or every place, so that you have a conception of education like Confucius, a lifelong learning. B, it was tied to not just kind of degree, but also the question of what it means, larger question, what it means to be human. So fortunately, not everything is lost in the world, in the Islamic world, although things have been diluted. But you still see a lot of people who are not satisfied with their modern education degrees and so forth. I myself is an example, and I know many, many examples where people thought, for questions related to meaning of existence, moral life, they need to find a teacher. Today, in the West, we talk about gurus. You can see it's still there. Why is it that we're so interested in Buddhism, in yoga, and all of these? Because universities have been transformed into some kind of corporate model in such a way, that you go there just to have some skills. And teachers are content providers, students are consumer. People even use those terms. So yeah, I think that not everything is lost. There's a way to revive. And again, we have to be careful about the abuses, careful about manipulations, but we shouldn't be throwing the baby out, so to speak, the bath water. Just because a surgeon might perform their surgery in a way that's not very inefficient, we don't completely forsake the entire doctor-patient relationship. The same is true here. I think there's a way to revive some of these features of education, even in the West. I think it's happening in some way in some institutions. But I'm actually optimistic that, things will get better, although, at the moment it's not looking so.
And did you have a question, Professor Said Farid? You're waving your hand.
Yeah, I just have a comment actually, based on what is being said by Shuchen and Muhammad Faruque. I think it's important, since we're talking about higher education, we're talking about universities, we have to relate and the possibilities for changes, which Muhammad Faruque was mentioning. Um, the possibility for decolonial types of changes, moving away from a neoliberal university obsessed with metrics and ranking and so on, and also from a Eurocentric university. We have to relate that to the overall decline of the West, which is happening before our eyes, right? Although it's going to be an extremely long process. But what is happening now, the war in Gaza, and the war on Iran, Iran's response, the inability of the United States to actually win this war, which I think it's a shock to many Americans. But at the cultural and political level, the decline of support for America, the utter disappointment with Europe, the feeling that many people have that Europe is impotent. It's not a master of its own destiny, and so on and so forth. And of course, for some time, for a couple of decades at least, decolonial scholars have been talking about the possibilities of a multipolar world and a pluriversal world. So the multipolar, of course, relates to the political, but more related to education is the idea of pluriversity. The pluriversity in terms of culture, in terms of social arrangements, and that's where education comes in. That we are looking forward to a world which is not dominated by Eurocentric education, by one model, the Western neoliberal model, but which is where you would have a diversity of not just content, but also in terms of structures of education. So I think that is what we should be talking about, and maybe thinking about what are the possible models in terms of structure and also in terms of content, curriculum for higher education across the global South. That we imagine, what do we imagine will develop in the next 50 to 100 years?
Thank you so much for that. We are out of time, and it's a good moment to end on, actually. So thank you so much for both our speakers and our discussants, Shuchen, Muhammad, Said Farid, and Farah from Cambridge, and all the attendees for your comments and questions, some of which are in the chat. Let us know what kind of event you would like to have next. We can always continue this with another event in the future. Thank you so much, and thanks for the SRHE for hosting us, and all the best, and good night if you're tuning in from Asia.
Good night.
Thanks,
Thank you very
everyone.
much, Ibrar. It was
Thank you
it was
so
great.
much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
To do this again.
Thank you. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.